A punch in broad daylight, straight across the jaw of the very deputy who framed her 5 years ago. The small-town crowd freezes. Blood hits the sun-scorched dust. But behind that fist is a story no one saw coming. She was just 17 when they locked her up in the state facility. Now she's out, standing face to face with the man who stole her youth. What follows isn't just about revenge. It's a fight for truth in a desert town that learned long ago to look the other way. This woman isn't broken. She isn't bitter. She is the one person who can bring the whole corrupt edifice down, and she does it without ever raising her voice. Stay with us. Because this story goes deeper than a viral video, and trust us, you won't see how it ends. Let us know what time it is where you are and where you're watching from. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. These are the stories that need to be told. The Arizona sun was an adversary that day, hanging low and blistering like a spotlight turned on the innocent. It was the kind of heat that melts asphalt on the road and makes every breath feel heavy, as if the desert itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to crack. In the center of Viridian's town square, a place where tired traditions and long, hot afternoons converged, a young woman stood as still and silent as a figure carved from the years they had stolen from her. She was tall, with a lean strength, no more than 22, but she carried herself with an authority that made space around her. Sharp, watchful eyes, a faded work shirt 2 sizes too big, and a controlled fire that only life behind razor wire could forge. Her hands were tucked deep into her pockets. Not from cold, but from a hard-won instinct. Keep your hands where they can't be misread. Keep your breathing steady. Keep your gaze forward. Lena Reyes had been waiting 5 years for this moment, though she hadn't consciously known it until right now. The square was deceptively sleepy. A rancher in a worn Stetson checked his phone. An elderly woman fanned herself on a bench. A group of teenagers loitered near the old water fountain, their laughter echoing faintly. Life had moved on, as it always does, utterly oblivious that something irreversible was about to tear through the fabric of their quiet town, right there on that patch of baked earth. And then she heard it. The heavy, unmistakable rhythm of boots worn with authority. Not rushed, not casual, just the smug cadence of a man who believed the ground he walked on belonged to him. Lena didn't look up immediately. She knew that sound in her bones. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Her spine straightened, her heartbeat slowed to a deliberate, cold rhythm, and a breath caught somewhere between her ribs. "Well, I'll be," came the voice, a gravelly mix of surprise and disdain, like he was chewing on something rotten. "Didn't think they'd ever let you out of your cage." The words cut through the afternoon haze, sharp and practiced. She raised her head slowly, not out of fear, but because if she moved too quickly she might shatter the fragile restraint she'd spent 5 years building. And that was something she couldn't afford to lose. Not now. Deputy Frank Miller. He was older, grayer, but otherwise exactly as she remembered. A square jaw, lips permanently curled in a half-sneer of contempt, and pale blue eyes that scanned people like they were inventory. His badge gleamed on his chest, a polished license to ruin lives. She said nothing, just held his gaze. Sometimes silence is a weapon, heavier and more potent than any shout. "You still holding a grudge about that little misunderstanding?" he taunted, stepping closer, just enough to invade her space, but not enough to be illegal. "You ought to be thankful. Penitentiary makes girls like you tough, right?" Lena's fingers curled inside her pocket, brushing against the smooth edges of an envelope, the one stamped with the word exonerated, the one that was supposed to signify freedom. But standing here under his shadow, she realized it meant something else entirely. Her focus narrowed, the sounds of the square fading into a dull roar. A truck downshifting, a door slamming, a dog barking. All she could hear was the echo of her 17-year-old self, screaming her innocence on the floor of a convenience store while he stood over her, cuffing her wrists and muttering, "You people always play the victim." Perhaps the healed version of herself would have walked away. Maybe that's what a rational person would have done. But healing doesn't always mean forgiveness. Sometimes healing means exposing old scars to the same fire that created them, just to prove you can no longer be burned. She took a single step forward, looked him squarely in the eyes, and said in a low, quiet voice, "You thought I'd stay small." He blinked, thrown by her composure. "What?" That's when she moved. It wasn't a wild, telegraphed swing. It was precise, clean, and delivered with the focused power of 5 years of suppressed rage. Her right fist, clenched so tight it felt like it held the weight of every ignored plea and every locked door, connected with the side of his jaw. There was a sickening crack. His head snapped to the side, his knees gave out, and he collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, blood darkening the corner of his lip before his back even hit the dusty ground. Gasps rippled through the square. Someone dropped a bottle, a woman shrieked, a phone clattered as a bystander fumbled to record. Lena didn't move. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't sorry. She looked down at him, not with triumph, but with a profound and hollow sadness. The kind that comes when the one person who owes you the world finally hits the floor, and you realize an apology was never coming anyway. A man nearby whispered, "Did she just knock out a deputy?" Someone else added, "He was goading her. I heard him. He started it." Phones were already up, their lenses capturing an image that would spread like wildfire. But Lena didn't notice. She wasn't performing. For the first time in 5 years, she was fully present in her own life, and her actions belonged to her alone. Sirens began to wail in the distance, their red and blue lights flashing against the sun-bleached adobe walls. She didn't run. She didn't even glance around for an escape. Instead, she crouched beside the man who had ripped her youth away, looked at his stunned, unconscious face, and whispered, "Now we're even." An old town security guard shuffled forward nervously. "Ma'am, you gotta stay right there. The sheriff's on his way." She rose to her full height. "Let him come," she said, her voice clear. "I have nothing left to hide." When the system that is supposed to provide justice fails so completely, does an act of personal defiance become a necessary correction, or just another form of violence? Standing beneath that unforgiving sun, surrounded by confusion and 100 staring eyes, Lena Reyes understood that justice doesn't always arrive quietly. Sometimes, it has to kick the door down and lay a man flat on his back, and she would not apologize for being its messenger. What would you have done? It's strange how quiet a prison gets when the lights go out, as if the concrete walls are holding their breath, waiting to see who will break first. Lena learned early on that noise wasn't the real punishment. It was the crushing stillness, the kind that made the sound of your own anxious heartbeat, a deafening drum against the silence. Her first night in that cell, she didn't weep or rage or beg to call her family again. She just stared at the cracks in the ceiling, trying to remember what it felt like to be a whole person. They processed her like an object on an assembly line, fingers stained with ink, name mispronounced with indifference, mugshots taken with a flash that made her flinch. The intake officer said, "Don't you worry, honey. You'll be out in a few months if you just keep your head down." But that was before the charges were mysteriously upgraded, before the overworked public defender missed a crucial filing deadline, before Deputy Miller repeated his story on the record, embellishing it with each telling. That was before the truth ceased to matter. The county courtroom smelled of stale air and nervous sweat. The judge never once met her gaze. Her older brother, Matteo, sat on a wooden bench behind her, his hands clenched into fists, whispering prayers that were swallowed by the cold, legalistic drone. "We have an eyewitness, Your Honor," the prosecutor declared. Lena turned her head, already knowing who she would see. There he was, Deputy Miller, hand resting casually on his badge, his voice steady, his eyes empty of everything but absolute conviction. "She attacked the store owner first," he lied. "I attempted to de-escalate, but she became violent and resisted arrest." The fabrication was so seamless it could have been true, except for the tiny, almost imperceptible twitch in his jaw when his eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. "There were cameras in that store," she whispered desperately to her lawyer. He nodded absently, promising he'd look into it, but he never did. He told her a plea bargain was their only realistic choice. 6 months in juvenile detention, maybe less with good behavior, he'd advised. "You don't want to risk a jury trial, not with this deputy's reputation." Lena had no record. She had a scholarship offer. She had plans. She had a future. None of it made it into the court record. Lena was told to trust the process. But what do you do when the process itself is designed to crush you? When the gavel fell, sentencing her to a minimum of 36 months in a state correctional facility, Matteo let out a choked sound so loud the bailiff shot him a warning glare. Lena didn't flinch. She just felt something inside her chest collapse, like a door slamming shut on the person she used to be. How much faith can you have in a system that refuses to see you? The prison wasn't all bars and chains. It was beige cinder block walls, buzzing fluorescent lights, and days that smeared into one another like a watercolor painting left in the rain. Her uniform was stiff and smelled of bleach. The food was always lukewarm. The guards treated her like she was invisible, unless they needed someone to make an example of. Her cellmate, a tough girl named Rosa with 5 years for aggravated assault, gave her the only advice that mattered. "Keep your mouth shut, Reyes," she'd said. "Eyes down. Don't volunteer for nothing. Don't act like you're smarter than them." Lena nodded, learning that even truth has to be bent to survive in a place built on lies. At night, she would sit on the edge of her bunk, knees drawn to her chest, and stare at the small barred window high on the far wall. It didn't open, and showed nothing but a sliver of the vast, empty sky. But she learned to memorize the shapes of the clouds, the way the light bled from pale morning blue to the bruised purple of dusk. It was her only reminder that the world outside was still turning. Letters from Matteo came every week at first, crammed with frantic reassurances on lined paper. "I'm still fighting, Hermanita," he wrote. "We're going to get this fixed." Lena would press the letters to her face when no one was looking, whispering, "I know," into the cheap paper. But after a year, the letters came less frequently, filled with a tired resignation. Then, one day, the prison chaplain came to her cell instead. "He's gone, Lena," he said gently, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "A construction accident. It was instant." Lena didn't make a sound. She didn't cry. She simply walked to her bunk, lay down, and didn't speak for 3 days. Rosa didn't offer condolences, but she left a precious orange from her commissary on Lena's pillow. a silent acknowledgement of a grief that had no place to breathe. Grief in prison is a contraband emotion. You don't get to fall apart. You fold it up, make it small and sharp, and hide it under your skin like a weapon you might need later. She started writing letters to her dead brother, pages and pages filled with the things she could never say. Today, the pasta tasted like wallpaper paste. Today, I saw a guard throw a girl in solitary for smiling at the wrong time. But she also wrote other things, just to see the words exist on paper, just to feel like she was still a person worth remembering. I'm not what they say I am. I still remember who I am. 2 years in, a volunteer teacher changed everything. Mrs. Ortega was an older woman with kind, weary eyes and a warmth that could make even that sterile environment feel a little less cold. She taught a writing workshop in the library once a week. Lena resisted at first, but the idea of telling her story, her real story, pulled at her like an anchor. In that small room, armed with a cheap pen and flimsy paper, Lena began to write. At first, it was fragmented. Then, it became raw. Finally, it became the truth. He lied, she wrote. I never touched anyone. But he needed a monster, and I was the closest thing he could find. Mrs. Ortega read it, looked her directly in the eye, and said, You keep telling this story. The world is a stubborn listener, but eventually, it hears the truth. Maybe Lena didn't believe her yet, but it was enough to keep her pen moving. 5 years passed. She grew taller, her voice deepened, and her stare became as sharp and unyielding as the desert landscape she came from. She spent every spare moment in the prison library, devouring case law, learning the mechanics of appeals, of exoneration. When her release date finally arrived, she didn't cry with relief. She just stood at the front gate, clutching a worn folder that held the judge's signature on her release and a letter from a pro bono law firm that had, after 4 years, finally found the security footage, the very footage her first lawyer had never bothered to request. As the gate buzzed open and she stepped into the blinding sunlight for the first time in half a decade, her shadow stretched out long and thin behind her. She didn't look back. She just whispered, I remember, and began walking toward whatever form of justice was waiting for her down the road. The gate buzzed open with the same institutional hum she'd heard 1,000 times before, but this time it wasn't for a head count or a meal line. This time they called her name, and it was her time to step through to the other side for good. She stood there in clothes that were 5 years out of style and state-issued canvas shoes, a manila folder held so tightly against her chest it was a wonder it didn't tear. The guard at the gate was a new face, who barely glanced at her. Sign here, he grunted, tapping a clipboard. His voice was flat, bored, as if releasing someone from 5 years of wrongful imprisonment was no different from checking out a piece of equipment. She signed her name without looking at him. He slid the outer gate open, and Lena Reyes stepped into a world that no longer had locks on its doors. The desert morning air was a shock to her system. Crisp, open, and so wide it felt sacred. The light wasn't the harsh, buzzing fluorescent glare of hallways. It was warm and golden, casting long shadows from the Joshua trees and catching in her eyelashes. The sounds were overwhelming, the distant rumble of a freight train, the cry of a hawk overhead, someone laughing into a phone nearby. Real laughter, free and uninhibited. She stood still for a full minute, just breathing, letting the world press in on her like a tangible proof of her own existence. A beat-up silver sedan rolled to a stop at the curb. The window came down, and a familiar voice cut through the air. You gonna just stand there catching flies, Or are you getting in before they change their minds?" Lena smiled, a real, genuine smile that felt like stretching a muscle she hadn't used in forever. It was Sophia, her best friend since childhood, the one who taught her how to drive, and who held her hand at her mother's funeral. Sophia now wore a crisp blazer and an expression of someone who worked 60-hour weeks at a law firm in Phoenix, but would still drive 4 hours into the desert at dawn when it mattered. Lena slid into the passenger seat, closing the door gently, half afraid it might dematerialize. "You cut your hair," she observed, her voice raspy. Sophia chuckled, reaching over to squeeze her arm. The touch was grounding. "You got taller," she replied, her eyes scanning Lena's face. "And harder." Lena looked down at her own hands, the knuckles slightly scarred. "I had to." They drove in silence for a while, a comfortable, respectful silence that let the moment breathe. A low, instrumental track played softly on the radio. Outside the window, the world rushed by too quickly. Cars, signs, people walking with purpose. For Lena, everything had changed. Every dusty gas station, every billboard, every saguaro cactus seemed to be whispering, "You're back, but you'll never be the same." Sophia pulled into a diner on the outskirts of Viridian, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone Hun. Lena paused before getting out. "Is this okay?" she asked, a reflex from years of seeking permission for every small action. "I don't want to start anything." Sophia shut off the engine and met her gaze. "You didn't start anything, Lena. And you're done asking for permission." Inside, they slid into a booth by the window. Lena instinctively took the seat with her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the room before she allowed her shoulders to relax. She didn't bother with the menu. She just watched the steam rise from Sophia's coffee cup. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," she admitted. Sophia methodically stirred sugar into her cup. "You start with an omelet," she said simply. "We'll figure out the rest later." The food tasted like freedom. It was hot, fresh, and real. Lena didn't realize tears were silently streaming down her face until Sophia pushed a napkin across the table. "I didn't think I'd ever eat anything hot that wasn't served on a plastic tray," she whispered. "I didn't think I'd eat without having to count how many bites I had left." Sophia let her cry, sitting with her in that shared silence until the storm inside her quieted. Then she pulled a thick legal folder from her briefcase and slid it across the table. "This is everything we have on the exoneration. And this," she said, flipping to a grainy but clear still frame from a security video, "is the moment the real perpetrator shoved the clerk, time-stamped, dated, and buried by the prosecution." Lena stared at the image, her vision blurring. "How long did you know?" "We found it 2 years ago," Sophia answered. "It took this long to get a judge to listen." Lena touched the paper as if it were a holy relic. "He knew it wasn't me," she said, the words heavy with 5 years of betrayal. "He always knew." "Yes," Sophia said, her voice firm. "And now everyone else will too." They spent the rest of the meal discussing logistics, court dates, the civil suit that would follow, the potential for press attention. But beneath the legal strategy was the unspoken truth. Freedom wasn't the end of the fight. It was the beginning of an entirely new, and perhaps even harder, one. 5 years were stolen, but freedom isn't a simple reset button. Can a person ever be truly free when the man who put them away still walks the same streets, protected by the same system? What does freedom even mean after that? Later, as the sun began its descent, casting a golden glow across the desert floor. Lena stood outside the diner, letting the light warm her face. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the envelope containing her official exoneration letter. The paper was creased and soft from being handled so many times, but it was hers. She held it up, letting it catch the light like a flag of a country she was just now re-entering. 5 years, she said softly. All for a lie. Now it's his turn. Sophia came out and stood beside her. You ready? Lena turned, her eyes clear and resolute. Not yet, she said. I want to walk. And so she did. She walked through the familiar, dusty streets of her hometown, past the courthouse, past the sheriff's station, and past the convenience store where her life had been shattered by the weight of a badge and a lie. She didn't stop or speak, just let the desert wind whip through her hair and her own 2 feet carry her forward. And somewhere between the old movie theater and the town square, she stopped being a girl who had survived and became a woman who remembered every single thing they had taken from her, and everything she planned to take back. When she returned to Sophia's car, the sky was a deep, bruised blue. She slid into the seat, exhaled a long, steady breath, and said, Okay, let's go find out what justice looks like when you no longer have to ask for it. And they drove off into a town that had forgotten her, but would never forget what was coming next. The silence that followed the punch wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, sucking the air and the sound out of the Viridian town square. Lena stood still, her arms hanging loose at her sides, her breathing slow and controlled, while the man who had worn his badge like a suit of armor lay crumpled in the dust, a trickle of blood seeping from the corner of his mouth. Around her, the world slowly lurched back into motion. People gasped, a few stumbled backward, some fumbled for their phones, while others just stared, transfixed, as if they'd witnessed a ritual sacrifice. Maybe they had. The concrete under her worn sneakers was hot, and the afternoon sun cast stark, unforgiving shadows that sharpened every detail. The outline of Deputy Miller's body on the ground, the trembling hand of a woman shielding her child's eyes, the glint of her own exoneration papers peeking out from her pocket. Somewhere to her left, a man muttered in Spanish, "She laid him out." Another voice, younger, added, "He provoked her. He called her by name." Lena wasn't listening. She didn't need a jury of her peers now. She had spent 5 years begging to be heard, and she was done begging. The sirens came quickly, their wail cutting through the desert heat. 2 county sheriff's vehicles screeched to a halt, kicking up clouds of dust. Deputies spilled out, hands resting on their holsters, their expressions a mixture of shock and confusion as they took in the scene. One of them, a young officer with a tense jaw, shouted, "Ma'am, step away from the deputy!" Lena didn't flinch. She simply raised her chin and said, her voice carrying clearly in the stillness, "I'm not the threat here. I'm the one he framed." The young deputy faltered, his eyes darting from Lena's calm face to the badge on the unconscious man's chest, then to the growing number of people holding up their phones, live streaming every second. The air was electric, brittle. In the age of social media, every private confrontation can become a public spectacle. Does being recorded protect the innocent by providing proof, or does it simply turn a personal battle for justice into public entertainment? Lena took one slow step backward, not out of fear, but to give them space, to show them she wasn't running. Another deputy approached, his hand near his radio. "Miss, we're gonna need you to stay put. Let's not make this any more complicated." Lena met his gaze. His eyes were tired, maybe even human, and said, It was already complicated. He made sure of that 5 years ago. With a deliberate motion, she reached into her shirt, pulled out the folded exoneration letter, the official state seal catching the sun. She held it out. "This says I was innocent," she stated. "You want to know why he's on the ground? Because he looked me in the eye and laughed about stealing my life." Behind them, Miller groaned, stirring. His face was chalky white beneath his tan, his pride shattered in front of an audience he could no longer control. One of the bystanders, phone still recording, stepped forward and said loudly, "I saw the whole thing. He was harassing her, taunting her. She didn't swing until he got right in her face." Another woman near a vendor cart chimed in. "It felt personal. He wasn't acting like a cop. He was acting like a man with a grudge." The deputies exchanged a look, caught between protocol and reality, between their training and a truth that was now playing out on dozens of tiny screens. Asha watched them, reading their hesitation the way she'd learned to read guards on the cell block, looking for the moment things would turn against her. But it didn't. Not this time. Instead, one of them said, his tone softening slightly, "Can I get your name, ma'am?" She nodded. "Lena Reyes." The younger deputy's brow furrowed in recognition. "Reyes," he mumbled, pulling out a notepad. "There was that case, years back." His voice trailed off as the pieces clicked into place. "Yes," Lena said, her voice flat. "He was the arresting officer. He lied on the report. I served 5 years. I was released 2 months ago." The deputy looked down at the groaning man, then back at Lena. "I think we need to get internal affairs on the line," he said quietly to his partner. "We don't need this becoming a media firestorm without the right people involved." "Too late," someone called out from the crowd. "It's already live." Dozens of phones were out now, their red recording lights like tiny accusing eyes. Justice wasn't happening in a sealed courtroom anymore. It was happening in broad daylight, under the scrutiny of a town that had been silent for far too long. Lena stood through it all, her heartbeat now a steady, calm rhythm. The worst thing that could happen to her already had, and she'd survived. What came next wasn't about survival. It was about reclamation. Paramedics arrived, crouching beside Miller, shining a pen light in his eyes. "He'll be okay," one of them announced. "Couple of broken teeth, maybe a fractured jaw." Asha listened, unmoved. She hadn't wanted him dead. That wasn't justice. That was just more blood. Finally, one of the officers turned back to her. "You'll need to come with us, ma'am, to give a full statement. You're not under arrest, but this is complex." Lena gave a single nod. "I know," she said. "Complex is all I've ever known." As they led her toward the squad car, not in handcuffs, not with force, but with a careful, public deference, she glanced back at the dust stained with Miller's blood. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was a statement, a public record that no court could ever expunge. And it was just the beginning. The walls were supposed to be white, but had faded to a dispiriting gray, as if the paint had absorbed too many secrets and lost its ability to reflect light. The air inside the interrogation room hummed with the faint, incessant buzz of an overhead fluorescent panel that flickered, casting a stuttering light across the scarred metal table where she sat. Lena was still, her wrists unbound but her shoulders rigid. Her eyes tracked the flickering light, a habit learned in the numbing boredom of a prison cell. The room smelled of old coffee, dust, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She didn't ask for water. She just waited. That was the primary lesson of prison. Not patience, but the art of waiting, of surviving through stillness, of thinking without showing a single sign of it on your face. The camera in the upper corner of the room blinked its tiny red light. A vent overhead hummed a single, monotonous note. When the door finally opened, it was with a slow, deliberate creak that communicated control. 2 detectives entered. One was tall and angular, in a pressed shirt, his expression a practiced mask of professional concern. The other was older, heavier, with a coffee-stained tie and a notepad he held, but never wrote in. They pulled out chairs, the scraping of metal on concrete grating on her nerves, and sat down as if they had all the time in the world. She didn't look away, meeting their gazes with the same cold composure she'd worn as armor for 5 years. "Miss Reyes," the tall one began, his voice smooth. "We need to talk about what happened in the town square." Lena raised an eyebrow slightly. "You mean the part where your deputy harassed me, or the part where I stood my ground?" The older detective shifted his weight, glancing at the thin file on the table. "Look, we're not here to pass judgment," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But this thing has a lot of eyes on it now. We've got pressure coming down from the top." Lena leaned forward, just enough for them to see the unwavering fire in her eyes. "Good," she said softly. "Because I've got a list of names, dates, and every formal complaint he made disappear." They both paused. It was a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation, but it was enough. She'd hit a nerve they weren't prepared for. The younger detective cleared his throat. "We are aware of his service record," he said carefully. "But the priority right now is containing the fallout from this incident." She could almost see the calculations happening behind their eyes. How to protect the department, how to manage the narrative, how to frame her without giving her actions legitimacy. "You're not charging me," she stated. It wasn't a question. "And you're not here to get the truth. You're here to figure out how big a fire this is going to be, and how you can keep your own house from burning down." The older detective sighed. "You're not under arrest, Miss Reyes. Nobody is putting you in cuffs. But this situation, it's going to get messy." "It's been messy for 5 years," she retorted. "This is just the first time you've had to clean it up." The younger one leaned back, frustrated. "We've got the ACLU calling. Civil rights groups are demanding a full, independent investigation. Miller isn't getting any public sympathy, if that's what you're thinking." "I'm not thinking about him," she said, her voice dropping lower. "I'm thinking about the people who enabled him, the ones who let his lies destroy lives, and looked the other way." They had no answer for that. They just sat there, caught between their duty to their department and the uncomfortable, undeniable truth sitting across from them. There was a sharp knock at the door. The younger detective got up, opened it, and after a brief, muffled conversation, he returned with someone else. The man was slim, sharply dressed in a dark gray suit that seemed out of place in the dusty station. He exuded a quiet confidence. He walked directly to Lena and extended a hand. "Miss Reyes," he said, his smile polite but firm. "My name is David Harmon. I'm with the Arizona Justice Project. I'll be representing you from here on out." She shook his hand. His grip was solid. "This interview is concluded," Harmon announced to the detectives, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Any further questions for my client can be submitted in writing to my office. She will cooperate fully, but only with counsel present." The detectives nodded stiffly. Lena stood, her chair scraping but not trembling. She followed Harmon out of the room, down a hallway that reeked of ammonia and denial, past the booking station that still held ghosts of her 17-year-old self. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the desert sky in streaks of orange and purple. She looked at Harmon. "How bad is this going to be?" she asked. He paused, looking not at her, but at the horizon. "Bad enough to shake this entire county to its foundations," he said, "but good enough to finally start something that looks like justice." One person's courage, when finally displayed, can ignite a fire that exposes years of hidden rot. But is it fair that the first person to stand up has to risk everything just to clear a path for others? Why does it often take a martyr, a viral video, a public punch for a community to finally find its voice? Lena nodded, accepting the weight of his words. "He thought no one would ever believe me," she said quietly. "And he was almost right." "Almost," Harmon agreed, "but not this time." They walked toward the parking lot as the air began to cool. She was walking away from another sterile room that had tried to put her in her place, but she knew now the only place she was going was forward, and she wouldn't be walking alone. It started with a clip just under a minute long, shaky and pixelated from a bystander's nervous hand, but its content was devastatingly clear. It showed a uniformed white deputy, Frank Miller, leaning into the personal space of a young Latina woman. He was speaking, his expression a mask of derision. She stood her ground, unmoving, and then, with a single, precise motion, delivered a punch that sent him sprawling into the dust. The camera lingered on her face afterward, calm, still, almost serene, as the first sirens wailed in the distance. Within an hour, the video had gone viral. It was on every social media platform, replayed on news sites, and dissected in comment sections framed by hashtags like Viridian Uprising and Ad Justice for Lena Reyes. People wrote captions like, "He stole 5 years of her life." She took back 30 seconds. It wasn't just a trending topic, it was a digital reckoning. As the view count soared into the millions, Lena watched it all from a borrowed armchair in Sophia's small apartment, her jaw tight, feeling a dizzying mixture of vindication and exposure. Sophia sat beside her, her own phone buzzing relentlessly with calls and texts from journalists, podcasters, and even a producer from a national news network. "They're calling you the face of a new movement," Sophia murmured, scrolling through a torrent of messages, her eyes wide. She paused at one from a stranger that simply read, "Thank you for punching history in the mouth." Lena didn't smile. "They only see the punch," she said quietly. "They don't see the 5 years that loaded it." Outside, a group of local activists had already organized a vigil in the town square. Not a protest, just candles and signs demanding accountability. Lena hadn't asked for any of it. She hadn't intended to become a symbol. She had just wanted to breathe. But her truth, buried for so long, had finally erupted, and it refused to be contained. News anchors debated the story from their polished studios. Some framed it as a case of righteous anger against a corrupt system. Others called her actions a dangerous breakdown of law and order. One pundit asked, "Should we be celebrating vigilante justice?" Another shot back, "Maybe we should be more worried about a justice system that creates so many vigilantes in the first place." But the voices that resonated most deeply weren't the ones on television. They came in direct messages from people who had lived similar stories, women who had been dismissed, men with bogus arrest records, mothers whose sons had been lost to routine traffic stops. They shared their own traumas, their own hidden scars. One message said, "I was 17 too. He called me the same names. You didn't just fight for you. You fought for me." Lena read every single one. Some made her weep. Some filled her with a cold rage. But all of them helped her understand that what happened in that square was about more than just her and Miller. It was about every courtroom where a person of color is presumed guilty, every badge used as a weapon instead of a shield, and every promise of justice that dies in a dusty file cabinet. Her lawyer, David Harmon, acted swiftly, issuing press statements and filing legal motions. "We aren't just defending you, Lena," he told her, his voice calm and steady over the phone. "We are putting them on trial. Every case Deputy Miller ever touched is now a liability to this county." "What if I don't want to be in the spotlight?" she asked him once, her voice trembling slightly. "Then we use that spotlight to illuminate the shadows," he replied, "until there's nowhere left for them to hide." The night of the vigil, the Viridian town square was filled with people holding candles, their small flames flickering against the desert twilight. Someone handed Lena a megaphone. She hadn't prepared a speech. She simply stood on the steps of the old post office and spoke from the heart. "I didn't hit him for what he did to me," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I hit him for what he never had to answer for." The crowd was hushed. Then someone whispered, "Amen." And another person said, "Tell it." Suddenly the air was thick with a sense of shared purpose, a collective breath of a community tired of being silent. Later, as the candles burned down and people began to disperse, a teenage girl with dark, expressive eyes approached her. "Does it ever stop hurting?" she asked softly. Lena looked at her and saw her own 17-year-old self. She knelt down to meet her gaze. "No," she answered honestly. "But one day, it stops being the only thing you are." And that was the truth she hadn't learned in prison or in a law library, that healing didn't mean forgetting, and justice wasn't just about peace. It was about ensuring the wound was finally exposed to the open air, where everyone had to see it. Long after the square had emptied, she remained a solitary figure under the vast, starry sky. The wind picked up, and she closed her eyes, listening not for sirens or speeches, but for the sound of a new chapter beginning. Truth has a way of rising, not like a tidal wave, but like groundwater seeping up through cracks in dry earth. It starts slowly, in paper trails, whispered anecdotes, and redacted reports that refuse to stay buried forever. A week after the vigil, while the town of Viridian was still buzzing with the aftershocks of the incident in the square, David Harmon sat across from Lena in a diner booth. Between them lay a folder so thick it strained its seams. He opened it with the deliberate care of someone handling unexploded ordnance and slid a stack of documents across the table. "Read these," he said, his voice low. "And remember to breathe." They were complaint files, 17 of them in total, filed against Deputy Frank Miller over a period of 15 years. All had been dismissed. Lena's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the first one. It was a handwritten letter from a decade ago, the words scrawled in a desperate, pleading hand. A woman claimed Miller had slammed her teenage son's head against the hood of his car during a routine stop, leaving bruises that lasted for weeks. The case was closed with the note. "Insufficient evidence. Deputy acted within protocol." She turned to the next. A young girl, 14, accused of shoplifting at the same convenience store where Lena's life had changed, subjected to an unauthorized search in the back of his patrol car. Closed. No witnesses, no video, no further action. "There's a pattern," Harmon stated, watching her face. "The same justifications, the same language, different victims, same outcome. Silence." Lena didn't speak. Her fingers traced the edge of one of the statements as if trying to absorb the pain embedded in the ink. "Did they know?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible. "The sheriff's department. Did they just let this happen?" Harmon nodded slowly. "Some knew and looked the other way. Others just didn't want to know. But the ones at the top? They made sure no one else could find out. The county's Internal Affairs Division had launched a thorough review, a quiet, procedural move meant to placate the public. But once the media got wind of the 17 other complaints, the carefully constructed dam broke. Journalists flooded the county with public records requests. Community lawyers filed subpoenas. And one by one, people began to come forward. Their stories weren't all as dramatic as Lena's, but they were stories of abuse of power, of intimidation, of lives disrupted by one man's unchecked authority. A young mechanic named Carlos spoke on a Phoenix news station, his voice shaking with anger. He pulled me over when I was 19, told me my truck matched the description of a stolen vehicle. It was a lie. I spent the weekend in jail because I couldn't produce my registration fast enough. A retired dispatcher wrote an anonymous letter to a local newspaper. Everyone knew Frank was a bully with a badge, but he made arrests, and the higher-ups liked his numbers. If you questioned him, you were told to pick your battles wisely. The department tried to regain control of the narrative, calling it an internal personnel matter and issuing vague statements about due process. But it was too late. The video from the town square had cracked open a Pandora's box of public distrust, and the rot underneath was now exposed to the light. Lena experienced it all from a strange, dual perspective, living at the center of the story, while also feeling like a spectator. People on the street called her brave. Online trolls called her a thug. But no one was calling Frank Miller a hero anymore. He had been placed on administrative leave the day the news of his complaint history broke. By the end of the week, the police union had stopped returning reporters' calls. One evening, Sophia sat with her on the small apartment balcony, the desert air cool against their skin. "You know he's still at home, getting paid," Sophia said quietly, "watching all this on TV." "I know," Lena replied, looking out at the distant, flickering lights of the town. "But he's not sleeping well. Not anymore." She wasn't looking for retribution, not in the way people assumed. She didn't want him broken or ruined. She just wanted him to be seen the way she had been seen for 5 years. Raw, vulnerable, and unprotected, without a badge or a system to shield him from the consequences of his actions. And the story was finally changing. Students at the local community college organized a town hall on police accountability. The Viridian Town Council, under immense pressure, introduced a proposal for a civilian oversight committee. An anonymous artist painted a mural on the side of a burned-out gas station, Lena's face in profile, not angry, but resolute, above the words, "La verdad no se ahoga," the truth does not drown. David called again, his voice charged with a calm electricity. "There's movement," he said. "The DA's office is reopening 2 of his old cases. If even one leads to a conviction, it could mean decertification, maybe even criminal charges." Lena closed her eyes, letting the news settle over her, not as a victory, but as the first rumblings of a justice that had been silent for too long. "He'll still say I ruined his life," she said. "Let him," David replied, "because the rest of the world is finally listening to the lives he tried to erase." That night, Lena took out the complaint files again. She read each one, not to relive the pain, but to honor the names behind them. They were no longer ghosts in a filing cabinet. They were a chorus, rising together, their voices creating a wind at her back, a truth too loud to ever be buried again. For the first time since walking out of that prison, she felt something solid beneath her feet. Not survival, not rage, but purpose. The courtroom smelled of old wood polish, stale air, and the palpable tension of a community holding its breath. Lena walked through the heavy double doors, feeling the ghosts of every other time she'd entered a room like this in shackles. But today, her steps were firm. She wore a simple charcoal blazer, her back was straight, and her composure was an impenetrable shield. David Harmon walked beside her, his briefcase in one hand, his expression a calm mask of professional focus. They didn't need to speak. Their movements were coordinated with the silent understanding of a team that had prepared not just for a legal battle, but for a war of perception. While cameras weren't allowed inside, everyone in Viridian knew what was happening here. This wasn't merely a civil suit for damages. It was a public reckoning, filed in triplicate and placed on the docket for the whole town to see. The courtroom itself was a relic, its walls the same pale, institutional green, its clock ticking with the same indifferent rhythm. But she was different. She hadn't come here to plead for justice, she had come to demand it. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a voice that wasted no words, called the court to order. As Lena watched her, an unexpected flicker of respect rose within her. Not hope, not yet, but a sense of balance she hadn't felt in a legal setting before. Frank Miller sat at the defense table, looking deflated. Flanked by two expensive lawyers in sharp suits, he wore the vacant expression of a man who had not yet figured out how to convincingly play the victim. He stared straight ahead, refusing to let his gaze drift toward Lena. Not even for a second. David stood first, his voice a smooth, authoritative baritone as he laid out the foundations of their case. Wrongful imprisonment, malicious prosecution, and a pattern of systemic negligence. This case, he declared, his voice resonating through the silent room, is not about a single lapse in judgment. It is about a calculated pattern of abuse, sanctioned by a culture of silence, and the devastating cost of that silence. The jury, 5 women and 1 man, a cross-section of the county, listened, their faces attentive. No one fidgeted. No one looked away. The county's attorneys responded with dry, clinical arguments, insisting Miller's past record was irrelevant to the current claim and that justice had already been served through her exoneration. But their words felt hollow, stripped of all weight in a room heavy with unspoken truths. The first witness was a retired sheriff's deputy, a man named Jones, who had once been Miller's partner. He had come forward reluctantly, but his testimony was firm. "We used to joke about Frank being aggressive," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But looking back now, it wasn't a joke. It was fear, and we all played along." Next came a woman named Maria, whose son, now 25, still suffered from anxiety after an encounter with Miller as a teenager. "He flinches every time he sees a patrol car," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "That's what this man did. He took my son's peace." Lena watched them testify, feeling a strange mix of fire and ice course through her. Not just her own pain, but the collective pain of every person whose story had been buried, now finally rising to the surface in this courtroom. When it was her turn, she took the stand. Her voice was steady and clear. "I was 17, she began, making eye contact with the jury. "I had never been in trouble. I didn't steal anything, but he looked at me like I already belonged behind bars." She paused, letting the words land. "I spent 5 years of my life telling anyone who would listen that I was innocent. Not a single person in a position of power believed me, but they all believed him." The courtroom was so quiet that the ticking of the clock seemed to stop. "This lawsuit isn't about getting those years back," she concluded. "That's impossible. This is about making sure no one else has to disappear inside a lie like I did." After her testimony, the defense called Frank Miller to the stand. His performance was disastrous. He spoke in clipped, defensive phrases, his eyes darting around the room. He claimed he'd followed training protocols, but his words lacked conviction. When David Harmon cross-examined him about the 17 prior complaints, his answers became evasive. "I don't recall the specifics," he repeated over and over. "It was a long time ago." By the time he stepped down, the only sounds were the rustle of papers and the collective exhale of a town seeing its own reflection and recoiling in disgust. That evening, as the courthouse emptied out, Lena stood alone on the front steps. The verdict hadn't come yet, but in a way, it didn't matter. She had taken back her story. She had refused to be erased. The sun set behind the distant mountains, and she watched strangers walk by, none of them recognizing her. For the first time, the anonymity felt like peace, not invisibility. What does real justice look like after the headlines have faded and the cameras have gone? Maybe it looks like this: standing in the place where you were broken and feeling whole again. The verdict came down on a Thursday, on a day when the wind swept through the valley, making the American flag above the courthouse snap and flutter. Lena arrived early, sitting on a bench in the hallway outside courtroom 3B. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her breathing slow and measured, a calming technique she'd mastered long ago. David sat beside her, feigning relaxation as he scrolled through emails he wasn't actually reading. "No matter what they decide in there, Lena," he said softly, "you've already won. You changed the conversation in this town." Lena offered a small nod, less out of belief and more out of necessity. "I just want the truth to have consequences," she whispered back. "For once, I want it to actually cost them something." Inside, the jury filed in, their faces grim and unreadable. They had deliberated for 2 long days, and their expressions betrayed the weight of that task. The judge's voice cut through the tense silence. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A middle-aged man in the front row stood. "We have, Your Honor." Time seemed to warp, slowing down as it does in moments before a life-altering impact. The bailiff took the verdict form, handed it to the judge, who scanned it, her expression unchanging. She nodded once. "In the matter of Reyes versus the County of Viridian," she began, "we find in favor of the plaintiff." A collective, silent exhale seemed to pass through the courtroom. There was no applause, no outburst, just a profound quiet, filled with the weight of the moment. Lena blinked, a slow, deliberate motion, a tightness in her throat, a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for years, finally began to dissolve. She didn't look at Frank Miller. She didn't need to. He sat across the aisle, completely still, his hands knotted so tightly his knuckles were white. He was chewing on the inside of his cheek, a man being consumed by the very silence he once used as a weapon. The court awarded compensatory and punitive damages. It ordered a formal, public letter of apology from the County Board of Supervisors and mandated an immediate review of Miller's pension status, freezing all payouts pending the outcome of the reopened criminal investigations. The judge's voice remained even, but her gaze lingered on Lena for just a fraction of a second longer than protocol required. A small, human acknowledgement. "I see you." Outside on the courthouse steps, the air felt different, cleaner. Reporters swarmed, a chaotic scrum of microphones and cameras. "Miss Reyes, how do you feel? Was justice served today? What do you want to say to other victims?" Lena paused at the top of the stairs, looking not at any single camera, but at the crowd as a whole. "This isn't an end," she said, her voice clear and carrying over their questions. "This is what accountability starts to look like. Real justice would have been never needing to be here in the trial at all. The victory was undeniable, a number on a piece of paper, a headline in the news. But can any amount of money, or any formal apology, ever truly mend a life that was so profoundly broken? What does justice really mean when you can never get back what was taken? That night, in the quiet of Sophia's apartment, she sat by the window with a mug of tea, watching the headlights of passing cars slice through the darkness. Sophia came and stood beside her, placing a folded newspaper on the table. The headline read, "Exonerated and Vindicated. Lena Reyes wins landmark civil case." Lena traced the words with her finger. "Funny how easily they say my name now," she murmured. "Back then, I was just the suspect." Sophia put a hand on her shoulder. "You were always more than what they did to you," she said softly. "You just had to remind them." Lena didn't cry. The ache inside her was no longer about sadness. It was about the new, open space where shame and fear used to reside. She closed her eyes and sat in the stillness. A stillness that no longer felt like a punishment, but like a hard-won peace. And across town, Frank Miller sat alone in his darkened living room, the glow of his television screen illuminating his face. He watched the same headlines scroll by, his name and hers intertwined forever. The badge, the pension, the respect, all of it was gone. For the first time in his life, it wasn't her life under a microscope. It was his. And there was no closing that curtain ever again. The mural appeared in the pre-dawn hours, painted in silence by an artist who never came forward to claim it. On an old adobe wall facing the town square, her face emerged in soft, earthy tones of gold and terracotta. She wasn't depicted as defiant or angry, but as calm, resolute, and unbreakable. Her eyes looked out over the very patch of ground where she had once stood, where justice had finally been delivered by her own hand. Beneath the portrait, rendered in stark white letters, were 3 simple words. She stood. He fell. Truth rose. Even the city workers assigned to handle graffiti complaints took one look at it, nodded to each other, and drove away. Lena first saw it in a photo Sophia texted her at sunrise with the caption, "You belong to the city now." She didn't reply right away. Instead, she put on a hoodie, pulled it over her hair, and walked there alone. She stood before the mural for a long time, the early morning light catching the textures in the paint, listening not to the waking town, but to the quiet stillness inside her. A group of high school kids ambled by, their laughter echoing in the morning air. One of them stopped, nudging his friend. "Hey," he whispered, pointing discreetly. "That's her." Lena turned her head slightly and met their gaze, offering a small, acknowledging nod. They didn't rush over for a photo or a comment. They just stood for a moment in respectful silence before moving on, their voices a little quieter, as if they'd just passed something sacred. Later that week, the Viridian Town Council voted unanimously to pass the Reyes Mandate, a new ordinance requiring immediate public access to all police complaint histories and making body cam footage from any use of force incident available within 72 hours. When a reporter asked if the new law was a direct result of recent events, the council chairman said simply, "We've decided to stop pretending." Lena watched the vote on a live stream from her kitchen, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. She found her focus wasn't on the politicians, but on the quiet spaces between their words. Real change didn't always need a cheering crowd. Sometimes it just needed room to breathe. She started receiving invitations to speak at schools, libraries, and youth centers. At first, she turned them all down. What could she say that hadn't already been said in courtrooms and headlines? Then a handwritten letter arrived from a teacher at an alternative high school on the south side of the county. "My students don't trust the system anymore," the teacher wrote. "They barely believe in having a future. They need to see someone who made it through the fire." She stood before them a week later in a gymnasium that smelled of old varnish and youthful energy. There was no podium, just her, standing in the center of the room. "I'm not here because I'm extraordinary," she told them, her voice low and steady. "I'm here because someone tried to erase my story, and I refused to let them." A boy in the front row, his face a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, raised his hand. "Were you scared the whole time?" Lena nodded. "Every single day," she admitted. "But I learned that being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about not letting fear be the one who tells your story for you." Lena's journey started with a violent punch, but was ending with a quiet purpose. It begged the question, does changing the world begin with a loud, defiant act, or with the slow, patient, day-by-day work of helping one person find their voice at a time? That night, she walked past her mural again. Under the glow of the streetlights, its colors seemed deeper, its message more permanent. She sat on a nearby bench and pulled out a small notebook, not to write a speech, but to jot down the scattered thoughts she hadn't yet spoken aloud. Across town, Frank Miller lived in near total anonymity. People would recognize him at the grocery store and turn away, their whispers following him down the aisle. The silence he once wielded as a tool of power was now his own personal prison, a cold, constant fog he couldn't escape. Lena rarely thought of him anymore. Her focus had shifted. What mattered wasn't how he fell. It was what she was building in the space his shadow used to occupy. As the school buses rolled past her mural each morning, the city was slowly learning to carry her name, not as a fleeting headline, but as a permanent part of its memory, a story it refused to forget. The cemetery was on a hill overlooking the town, a quiet, wind-swept place where gravestones leaned like tired soldiers. The grass was dotted with stubborn desert wildflowers that grew where they weren't supposed to, a testament to life's insistence. Lena walked slowly, a folded paper held gently in her palm. She hadn't been back since her mother's funeral 5 years ago. She had attended that day in a borrowed black dress, chained at the ankles, forced to stand a respectful distance away as guards watched her every move. They hadn't let her toss a handful of dirt onto the casket. They hadn't let her say goodbye. Now she walked alone, finding the simple, weathered headstone. Isabella Reyes, beloved mother, fierce heart. The carving had faded, but the spirit of the words remained. She knelt in the soft earth and placed the paper on the grave. It was a certified copy of the court verdict, her name printed in bold ink beside the judgment in her favor. It didn't feel like a victory, not completely, but it felt like the truth, and a truth returned after being stolen for so long is its own kind of miracle. She didn't speak at first, just traced the letters of her mother's name. "Mama," she said finally, her voice steady and low. "I did it. I cleared our name. I made them say it out loud." A gust of wind lifted a few dry leaves into the air. She watched them dance and settle. "They almost took all of me," she continued, her voice catching for the first time. "Not just my time, not just my youth. They tried to take who I was." She sat back on her heels, letting the words hang in the quiet air, an offering to the woman who had never stopped believing in her. But I came back. I knew you never doubted me, even when I started to doubt myself. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silk sunflower, the kind her mother used to keep in a jar on their kitchen windowsill. She placed it at the base of the stone, her hand resting there for a long moment. A small yellow butterfly landed silently on the edge of the headstone, its wings gently pulsing. Lena watched it, not as a believer in signs, but as someone willing to accept a moment of grace when it appeared. She smiled, faintly, a smile for no one but herself. When she finally stood, a sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the path back toward the gate. She gave the grave one last look, a silent nod of peace and farewell. "I'm okay now, Mama." As she walked away, her shadow stretched long behind her. For the first time in years, it wasn't a phantom chasing her. It was just a part of her, following calmly, a memory she now carried instead of being carried by it. Somewhere between the stone and the sky, between grief and a new beginning, Lena Reyes walked back into her own life, finally finding a silence that felt like home. A year passed, marked not by dramatic events, but by the quiet rhythm of a life being rebuilt. Lena now worked part-time at a youth outreach center in Viridian. It was an old brick building with worn linoleum floors, but inside, it buzzed with the chaotic energy of second chances. Most days, she led a writing workshop, sitting in a circle with teenagers whose guarded eyes held stories they didn't yet know how to tell. She never forced them to speak. She understood the power of a silence that was chosen, not imposed. Some had records, some had rage, and all of them leaned in when she spoke, not because she was famous, but because she told the truth. "I'm not here to tell you how to live," she'd say, her voice low and even. "I'm here because I know what it feels like when the world has already written your story for you, and you have to find the courage to pick up the pen and write a different ending." One afternoon, a quiet girl named Kiara approached her, clutching a sketchbook like a shield. "Miss Reyes," she whispered, "my cousin. He's in juvie for something he didn't do. They said he matched the description." Lena looked into the girl's eyes and saw the familiar exhaustion, the same weary ache she had carried for so long. She didn't offer easy reassurances. Instead, she said, "Bring me the case file. We'll read every single word together." Later, she walked home through streets that were no longer a landscape of fear, but of memory. The mural of her face was still there, now a local landmark. The city hadn't erased her past, but it had made room for her present. Her small apartment was her sanctuary, a place filled with the quiet hum of a life she had earned. On her nightstand sat an offer letter from the local community college to teach a new course she had designed. Narrative Justice, Reclaiming the Story. She hadn't accepted yet, but the letter sat next to the notebook she'd kept in prison, its pages filled with the words that had saved her life. The next morning, she walked into the very juvenile detention center where she had once been processed in chains. This time, she wore a visitor's badge and carried a folder filled with resources. In a small, sterile room, she sat across from a girl no older than she had been when her life was shattered. "This place," Lena said gently, leaning forward. "It does not get to be the end of your story. Not unless you let it." Afterward, standing outside by the chain-link fence, she tilted her face up to the morning sun. Her past was no longer a ghost at her back. It was a scar, visible but healed. She hadn't forgotten what happened. She hadn't forgiven everyone, but she had made peace with the shape of her own survival. And somewhere across the country, another young woman who had seen Lena's story online picked up a pen, believing for the first time that her own voice might be strong enough to break the silence. That was the chapter Lena couldn't write herself, but the one she knew, with absolute certainty, would come next. She was no longer a case number, no longer a victim. She was the author of her own story, and this was not the end, it was the beginning. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a courtroom. It begins when a single voice, long buried, decides it will no longer be silent. Lena Reyes's story is a powerful reminder that dignity is not something that is given. It is something that must be reclaimed, often against impossible odds. She was silenced, framed, and forgotten, but she refused to disappear. And when the time came, she stood tall, not just for herself, but for every person who has ever been told they do not matter. Her journey was not about revenge or rage. It was about truth. A truth that began as a whisper and grew into a roar that echoed through a community, a city, and a nation that was finally ready to listen. For anyone who has seen justice delayed or denied, we know stories like these are more than just stories. They are warnings, and they are calls to action. So if this story moved you, if you saw a piece of yourself in Lena or in the powerful silence she shattered, don't let that feeling fade. Hit the like button so these stories continue to be told. Share it so someone else might find the courage to speak their own truth. And subscribe so you never miss a moment when justice rises again. Because the past doesn't stay buried. It just waits. And sometimes all it needs is one person, brave enough to walk straight back into the fire and refuse to blink.